So welcome everyone to the session of management alignment of multilingual vocabularies in social sciences and humanities. This is the session of the alignment of multilingual vocabularies in societies and humanities working group. And today we have two of the three co-chairs who will present and run the session. My name is Lisa Lehtsalu, and I'm from RDA Europe, where we're providing support to this working group through the RDA Tiger project. And before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone of the RDA values. So RDA is operating following 6 guiding principles, which include the openness, consensus, harmonization, community-driveness, nonprofit, and technology neutralness, and inclusivity. We are open to all opinions, and we hope to include all opinions and points of view, and work in a bottom-up way. If you haven't joined the RDA yet, on the slide, and the slides are also linked from the collaborative notes, you find a link, and to join as an individual member, it's free, and you can join after joining the RDA, you can join working groups and interest groups, including this working group here, to be up to date about what's happening. Next slide. And here, I'm handing it over to the co-chairs, Gemma and Arnaud, to take us away for this session.
Okay. So first, we would like to introduce a little bit the working group. Wait, sorry. Yeah, here. So right now, we are 3 co-chairs, Arnaud Gingold, that is connected, and me, myself, and Terry, that is not connected because of time issues. So you can register for the membership for the group right now, or yesterday at least we had 41 members register. You can join through the RDA website, and these are our objectives of the group. We would like to share knowledge and use cases about multilingual control vocabularies, but specific in the SSH, social sciences and humanities. But especially, we are focusing on this kind of multilingualism or multiculturalism that we think is a problem. Also, we will focus on interoperability and usability because we will follow the FAIR recommendations, and how we should work with versioning. There are other challenges that we cannot address, but you can see here some examples. The working group is organized for 18 months, working plan. At the end, we will produce some recommendation on how to verify and version these vocabularies, multilingual vocabularies, how to map and align, and so on. We have regular meetings every 4th Wednesday of the month. So, and we are also trying to alternate between 8 UTC and 15 to allow people from Asia and Australia and so on to be connected and share their concerns and their contributions. We are more or less at the end of the 6 months. So we are finishing the use cases analysis that we will discuss during this meeting. But we are talking all the time about vocabularies, but we want to highlight that the problem comes from the data in the humans, arts, and social sciences that could be ambiguous, messy, incomplete, and unstructured. And then the vocabularies have to follow or have to confront these problems. This is just, I'm not going to explain too much, but this is some examples of why this data can be ambiguous, because data is obscure, not sufficient granularity, is subjective, and so on. You have here some examples if you want to see better. The slides are shared in the meeting notes, and you can see it. Messy, this is some example that we can have problems with typos, different spellings in the social sciences, and they are inconsistent symbols that we don't always understand. So this problem of data reflects on vocabularies. Incomplete, for example, we have data that is incomplete and we have to complete. So this is an example of a ancient world that data is incomplete, and the scientists have to complete and try to understand. And also, the biggest problem is that this is unstructured data. So it's not that easy to follow a vocabulary and a structured data like a table. And researchers have to look for patterns and then construct something with these patterns. This is an example. And also it's very common to follow and find some bias on the data like this, like cultural bias. So taking into account all of that, we are trying to see how the social sciences and humanities make use of controlled vocabularies and which problems do they face. The problems are like this, like they are very disseminated, the vocabularies, and very different, very heterogeneous. There are a lot of vocabularies because they are specific for disciplines. So many disciplines, so many vocabularies, and so on. And they are disconnected, and they are not fully fair. So first we have to find it, they have to be aligned, they have to be connected, and that's difficult. And the another problem that we already mentioned, that the multilingualism that is very common in this area is not always English. We have to find how to relate everything. Yeah. So this, should I change to, do you take from this?
Yes, okay.
Okay, so I have to stop and then you. Or do you want me?
Yeah, no, wait a second. No, I will share my screen. Thank you for the presentation. So, as you've seen in the agenda, we plan to have first this stretch of presentations, and we have the discussion later. But if you have some question about the previous presentation from Gemma, maybe you can jump in directly, or else I go ahead with the presentation. No, so I will go a bit more into the details of the work we have started, which is a landscape study. Sorry for the slides moving. So it's still we don't have the document ready yet. We are currently writing it, so it would just be a summary of it. So about the control vocabularies, just in general, their creation and management is not the dimensional, and in the sense that it entails scientific, technical, and organizational aspects. And well, this is somehow stating the obvious, but with all that we've seen before in the presentation from Gemma, in the context of the SSH, we have specific issues with these multidimensionalities, which relate mostly with the nature of the data that reflects the specific aspects of the SSH or HASS, whatever the acronym is, because it relates with linguistic, cultural differences, and linguistic differences that also go through time, because we have some historical or even antique data to handle. And this is then something, and a specific challenge of the SSH, that is social sciences and humanities, that we see also in their control vocabularies. So, yeah, the landscape analysis objectives were to, the one objective was to extract from a list of examples, first the better knowledge of the challenges of cultural vocabularies in the SSH, also an inventory of proved best practices, and some perspectives about the improvement of the current practices or some past projects also. So the first step was to do that work was to select examples or use cases. And for that, the first selection criteria was obviously the disciplinary criteria. So we took mostly control vocabularies coming from the SSH area, specifically from social sciences, linguistics, digital humanities, and so on. But we also used as a term of comparison and more generic guidelines about multilingual control vocabularies, and this came specifically from the ISO norm that you see here mentioned. And I don't provide in the slides all the examples. We didn't have many examples, but we reviewed them carefully and specifically. More than that, the examples we chose were different in nature, which allowed to have a global overview of the situation. So like I said, we had guidelines. It's the case of the ISO. And also, I put here Getty Art and History Thesaurus guidelines, because although they are also in the field of the SSH, they were rather generic guidelines about creation, management of control vocabularies, multilingual control vocabularies. We also have examples coming from well-established SSH control vocabularies. We have specifically ELST from CISDA, also the concept registry from Clarion, which is about linguistics. And we had examples from best projects. So one coming from GoTriple, which is an NOPRAS era project, which is the organization I work for. And I contributed a bit to the project. That's why I know a bit more about the topic. And also from the SHOCK project, which was also a project dedicated to the SSH at large. So the linguistics, social sciences, and digital humanities again. And then we had also some examples of current experiments. They are not projects as such. They are looking for funding currently, to be frank. But they were interesting because they were more about the current trends in building control vocabularies. So they relate to translation and the use of AI, also about citizen science concepts, and which belongs to the from the angle of the SSH, although citizen science, of course, is not only for the SSH. So this was the diversity of the examples that we used. And the work we started to do in the landscape analysis, extracting the information from the various examples, that is, collecting bits of information that were not organized so much. And this is precisely the work we wanted to do as a preparatory work to then build the recommendations, precisely to organize all this diverse material. material. So from this overview, we got some types and definitions related to control vocabularies. So first, about the types of vocabulary themselves. So in our case, in this working group, we focused on topics, control vocabularies, because you can have control vocabularies like for types of documents, tools, and that kind of things. But precisely the specificity of the SSH is more visible and more probably, or we think also demanding. So we focus on vocabularies about topics. And in our prospect, we considered control vocabularies as a broad type of intellectual objects. So we didn't enter into or at least we didn't make selection based on the type of the control vocabularies, the thesaurus, taxonomies, ontologies, and so on. Although it's something to take into account, especially for the recommendations, the final recommendations we want to do, because the type of the control vocabulary, of course, has an impact on their creation and management. Like, for instance, if you have a flat control vocabularies or it's a hierarchical one, like thesauri, for instance. Another important aspects that we saw in the examples we reviewed relate to the workflows of control vocabularies creation. So in that case, it's not that we have clear-cut definitions, but we have a list of distinct operations to consider, which also should inform the building of the recommendations. So here I just put an example coming from ISO, and that is specifically related to the building of multilingual vocabularies. So there are various possibilities here, and it's good to have them clear in mind. So then you can translate an existing monolingual thesaurus. You can merge different monolingual thesauri, or you can create the different language versions simultaneously. And here, in the example of ISO, they are mentioning thesaurus, but it's not so much the point. It's specifically having in mind the current use of machine translation and AI, which allows precisely this huge process, the creation of these huge control vocabularies, which we'll see wasn't exactly the most common use case until recently, let's say. So in the landscape analysis, like I said in the introduction, we try to identify the main challenges. Like I said before, then they're related to the SSH landscape itself that we already quickly mentioned. So there is a fragmentation. The fragmentation has various aspects. First of all, there is a fragmentation in terms of disciplines, because SSH doesn't really exist as a whole. It's more an ensemble of various disciplines and sub-disciplines, and there's also fragmentation in terms of organization. You have many research institutes distributed in all countries. Also, there is a multilingualism, that is a specificity of the SSH, much higher than in other fields. You have also more present in the SSH cultural differences. There is also the fact that the terms used, even in the control vocabularies, are not exclusively scientific, which I think is also a specificity of the SSH. So just to summarize, and going back to this not strict distinction, just globally speaking, between technical, scientific, and organizational. From the technical point of view, this fragmentation implies that there is a lack of interoperable control vocabularies, meaning, first of all, there are many vocabularies. There are some, at least, vocabularies in various fields, maybe in various languages, meaning in various countries. And in addition to that, the technical level of these control vocabularies doesn't make them interoperable. which makes all the potential mappings between them rather complicated, which somehow justify also the use of automation tool to do these mappings. There is also this specific aspect of what I call not perfectly a low level of genericity of the concepts used, in the sense that they can tend to be precisely very specific to a discipline, to an area, to a country, and so on. So from the scientifical point of view, scientifical meaning the intellectual content of the vocabularies. So we don't use always scientific terms. Sometimes it can be terms of the common language, even if in a specific sense, which doesn't make things easier. We can have also, as we use common language, issues with the management of synonyms and homonyms. And there is also this notion of cultural non-coincidence. Just to give one specific example that was mentioned in the examples we had, there are some, if you want to enter control vocabularies about job positions, in some cases you don't have the same job position in all the countries, so it's not that it's difficult to translate, it just doesn't translate because it doesn't exist. So this is also a specific aspect of the SSH. And then from the organizational point of view, which again is more specificity of the SSH, is that it requires various kinds of expertise, scientific, but also linguistic for the translation, and the technical aspect that is common to all vocabularies. So these were the challenges, and then also from the examples we had, we try to identify not already best practices. These will be the recommendations of the working group, but let's say best practices dimensions at the moment. That is, by that we intend the set of components of what would be the best practices. So the first set relates to the methodology used for the building, meaning creating, updating, editing control vocabularies. So first of all, these methodologies, they can be explicit or not. It depends on the examples. Also, they can have aspects that, from the technical point of view, especially, are not SSH specific. So it's something to identify from that point of view. In the methodologies, there is specifically the notion of the workflow, which more and more relies on the mix between automation and human curation. And this is here where we see that the workflow definition is more or less explicit. Sometimes it's just sometimes it's well thought. Let's say in other cases it's just it's more experimental. And in the methodology, we have to put also the aspects that relates to generic best practices for control vocabularies. And so there is a question of doing either full or partial mappings, that is mapping only between sections of distinct control vocabularies. And this is important, especially when translation is involved. Instead of translating an entire vocabulary, you can focus on a specific area or subset and so on. There is a question also, and it was in the example of the ISO I mentioned before, the question of the translation, if it's from one language to many others, or between two languages or more languages, and so on, which implies questions precisely of biases also, because if you translate from one language to another, which is most often the case, that is from English or Anglo-American to other languages, you can include involuntarily some biases related precisely to this Anglo-American point of view, which is not a bias in itself, but depending to what you compare it, it can include some biases. Then there were in the best practices dimensions, there is also the question of the tools. So for that, there are some tools to build vocabularies or ontologies. I mentioned here the example of SCORS, which is well known. I don't insist on that. Just not everybody is able to manage it, but there are some tools to build fully interoperable vocabularies. And there are also tools to edit the vocabularies. There can be more services actually than tools. There is also among the tools now the machine translation tools and the artificial intelligence. Another important dimension related to that can help building best practice recommendations relate to the validation. So in the most extended guidelines, we saw that the best practice recommended, which doesn't mean that it is often implemented, is to have experts both in scientific and linguistic fields, actually, and that is people knowing the field or the topic or the object, but also people expert in linguistics and meaning translators, but themselves specialized in this kind of translation work. And that is a recommendation, but we see that with a development, rather recent, let's say, at least improvement of the quality of machine translation outputs, then this expertise that tends to be a bit reduced, let's say, but given the amount of results that machines can produce, the validation step requires even more attention, even if, yes, precisely something that needs to be a bit more reflected upon. Then, still on the same topic, the other best practices dimensions relate to sustainability. And from that point of view, that is a possibility to maintain the control vocabulary, to update it, and to maintain it, to sustain it also financially and organizationally. Let's say the best case that we saw had set up a dedicated team for the control vocabulary management, setting up even regular meetings. And even if you don't have this dedicated team, because it requires quite some effort to set that up. The minimal best practice, let's say, would be to plan and to organize for the updates. And here we go back to the question of the full or partial mappings or full or partial translation. The updates should preferably be partial to ensure high quality. Then the sustainability also in some cases, the guidelines recommended to have trained contributors. So that's what I said before, for instance, for the translators, that if you involve translators, they should know the specificity of the area of the linguistic practices and the cultural differences and so on. So not just translators, but trained translators. This relates a bit with the notion of having a dedicated team for the control vocabularies management. Then there is another set of recommendation that we should consider, and it relates, I would say, obviously, with the FAIR principles, which is an important dimension to ensure the quality of the control vocabulary, and especially in the SSH, because the verification of control vocabulary in the SSH can be highly improved. So I don't review them all here. I just mentioned, for instance, having identifiers for the concepts, URIs, preferably, having also licensing, clear licensing. I put here open licensing because this is the example. This is what did the examples we had, but at least having a clear licensing about the reuse of the control vocabulary. And there are also, of course, some interoperability features to consider for the control vocabularies. Just give here the example of SCOS, but there are obviously other way to ensure interoperability. But this set of this set of features allowing for verification is an important one. And then there is another dimension to consider, which is related to the usage. That is the tools that allow to access, but also to edit or to publish or even translate control vocabularies. And yes, so it's something that we want to address also in the recommendations, and it's another thing to keep in mind. So these were the best practices dimensions that we identified from the examples we had. And also from the examples, and to go back to what I said previously in the introduction, the examples allowed to have some kind of an overview of the state of the art of the current situation. So we see some that were used before, of course, the use of automation, automated translation, automated generation through AI. They were used before, but they've been much more used. The usage highly increased recently. And we can say that also considering precisely the guidelines, for instance, the Getty guidelines or even ISO, which just mention quickly these automation aspects, focusing more on the human expertise needed. And we see that situation changed a bit in the last years. And in fact, the experimental projects that we reviewed make a higher use of this automation tool, but with some questions about the validation of the results. So the fact is that for the automation, translational generation, the results have greatly improved, but they remain mostly experimental and have raise questions about the classical, I would say, the distinction between quantity and quality. It's easy to have to create lots of translation and lots of terms and concepts in many languages with the current tool, but then the question of the quality has to be addressed, and again, this wasn't always very clearly formalized or expressed in the examples we had, so it's still an open question. Precisely regarding human curation, and it's what I said before, the human action, the role of the experts was very much highlighted, and it was also in these general guidelines, the human action described in rather complex processes, where you had first meetings between scientific experts, then exchanges with translators, and then communication with the technical team for the implementation. So besides the fact that it is complex, but and that it ensures at the same time high quality, there is a question to see how all this can be improved with the automation tools. And on the other end, the project that relies less on human curation, or where the human intervention is often described as the human in the loop process. It's not always entirely sure how much this process is satisfying for the specific case of the SSH, precisely because of the specificity and the complexity of the linguistical and cultural aspects of the terms used in these fields. And then regarding governance, I think I already said it before, it's an important aspect. We found rare examples of well-defined or fully defined governance for content vocabularies. And of course, it seems the most trustworthy solution to have these dedicated teams of various expertise working complex workflows, but it also requires time, workforce, and money. And it's difficult to set up. And yes, there is probably a good balance to find between a process that is easy to set up and then but also ensures good quality of the results. So set of provisional conclusions, which are also more questions that we can discuss later precisely in the discussion session. So we saw in these examples a lot of recommendations that are very specific to the control vocabularies, like the management of the equivalence between cultural vocabularies in different languages. It relates with the question of the synonyms or homonyms or cultural differences I mentioned before. And precisely that's the work we want to do here. These are very specific aspects, and we want to try to synthesize them a bit more. That's what we try to do, and what I try to present with these best practices dimension that you've seen before. There are a few examples of governed process for multilingual and multicultural vocabulary, so that would justify to have specific recommendations for SSH vocabularies. Again, taking into account what is actually possible, what is desirable, and so on, the degrees of priority, let's say, in building these fully governed processes. And yes, we saw an increased use of automated processes and raising question about the scientific quality and also cultural equity. Again, going back to the question of the biases mentioned by Gemma before, how the tools, how relying only on automation tool can really ensure that cultural equity is respected. And yes, the role of humans in the machine outputs validation is not always clear. I'm referring here to my own experience I mentioned before in this project Go Triple, where, for instance, myself, I reviewed some results of the automated translated concept with some expertise in the SSH field, some expertise in linguistic fields, but and not enough to cover all the challenges, all the questions precisely. But yes, that's more or less the current setup is, at least in the project. So here I'm talking about European projects. They have limited time, limited funding, and so on. So it's not possible to set up a full process. But still, there is the question of the role of the humans and the level of expertise that is put through these projects. So this was a presentation of our current state of the landscape analysis. That is basically extraction of information of some examples and the beginning of an organization, of a structuring of these elements that we identified to build then recommendations. And yes, I think with that I can close the presentation and open the floor to some questions. So we plan, like we said in the agenda, two moments of discussion. The first one on this landscape study itself, and then maybe on the next step for the working group itself. So you can see here some questions on the slides. You can find them also on the notes, the notes document that was shared before. But before addressing all these questions, or just some of them, I think I would like just to open the floor to you if you have questions already, suggestions or comments. Maybe. I don't know if you have questions on the chat. I don't see it.
Nothing in the chat at the moment.
So maybe first a quick question about yourself, just to know a bit more about you. If your role in the SSH field, and are you in the SSH field? Are you experts in concept vocabularies or something like that? If you want to present yourself just quickly, just to know who is in the audience. You can write the answer in the chat if you don't want to speak up.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Arno.
Hi, Curtis. Yeah.
We know each other.
Yeah.
So I'm in schools of EOSC, but I've also recently joined the TAB and I should be liaising with SSH groups. So I just wanted to get a feel of what some of the groups are doing. I'm not currently liaising with any particular group, but I just wanted to get a little bit more of what this group is doing, because it all kind of has something to do with that category.
Yes, no, thank you. Okay, so I see we have also somebody working in the climate environment, the research, I mean, area. Okay, and so I don't want to force you to speak, but just as it's a discussion. I have issues with the slides. Okay, yes, do you recognize in this presentation, because you're not all in the SSH area, do you recognize some issues in our own presentation that you have also in your own field, or is it completely different, or? And if it's the same kind of issues, how did you address them? Listen, yes, please.
Hi. So yeah, I'm the person who looks after the climate vocabulary. I've been involved in an RDA group where we've actually been looking at how to translate between different vocabularies, do mappings between different vocabularies in the scientific field, in environmental sciences, and they're similar to the social sciences. There are many vocabularies because there are different communities. So there are for example, there's climate research, there's ecological research, there's agriculture, there's biology, there's all sorts of different fields. And many of those vocabularies are overlapping. And but also there's no way you're going to persuade different communities to start using just one vocabulary. You know, you can't say, oh, we're going to have one vocabulary and everybody use it, covers all the areas, because nobody really has the expertise to maintain that. So we've been in the I Adopt working group. We came up with a way of mapping between one vocabulary and another by basically analysing the vocabulary terms, looking at the variables, as we call them. So what is it that you're observing? So you have this concept of an object of interest. So it might be a tree. So you want the height of a tree. So what are you observing? What are you measuring about it? And then there may be some other aspects of what the term is describing, such as the environment it's embedded in. So it's a tree in a field or something like that. So there are various sort of components of what the variables are. And then the idea is to use this framework rather than mapping individual vocabularies to one another. The idea is vocabulary managers help in mapping their own vocabulary to this more generic framework. And through framework is then a bridge to mapping similar concepts to one another. So it's not about translating from one human language to another, but it's more about sort of recognizing equivalences where different communities have maybe got similar variables, but they've called them something different because they have different, different practices in their community. So you might be interested in looking at the outputs from the RDA iAdopt working group. It's no longer an active group, I should say, but we are working on implementation within the environmental sciences. But the idea, our idea of a variable is meant to be very generic, so it doesn't have to be something scientific. It could be a medical term, it could be a social sciences term. So there may be something of interest in there to you.
No, definitely. Thank you for the suggestion. And yeah, and when you say that you are starting to implement it, in which context exactly? Because here it relates with the organizational aspects. How do you do that? Also,
Okay.
because it connects with many communities.
So we've just had a series of workshops actually, which were partly funded by the RDA Tiger funding, and so we basically got groups of domain experts together. So I attended a workshop where it was other people working in the atmospheric science domain, and basically we agreed ways of mapping particular variables and breaking them down according to this iAdopt framework. And we were looking at sort of common patterns that turn up in a lot of the variables. So you might have something which is for example, a flux of, so a common thing is to have something like I don't know, a flux of carbon dioxide from the ocean to the atmosphere. And there are many variables in environmental sciences to do with things moving from one part of the environment to another. So those are flux variables. And we agreed a particular pattern for how those should be broken down in terms of the iAdopt framework. That's just one example. But there was also there were people from the ocean domain who met together and did a similar process. We had somebody from the life sciences who wanted to talk about things like genetic type variables, which I must admit are not my domain at all. I didn't really understand, but they also were trying to describe that in terms of iAdopt. And the idea that at the moment is that we create these patterns for things that follow. We look for the commonalities in the way variables need to be described. And then the idea is to use those human mappings to train a large language model. So there's a company in Spain who've actually got some funding to do this. And we are just at the moment at the stage of finishing defining these patterns, which will then be used as training for the large language model to see how the model gets on in mapping other terms, because it's recognized it's actually quite a hard job for humans to map. And there are many terms in many vocabularies. We couldn't possibly just manually map them all to iAdopt. So that's the language that's been taken. That's the approach rather that's been taken. So some human guidance, if you like, and then try to train a large language model. I don't know yet, obviously, how successful that will be. That's an experiment, but that's the next step in how we're doing it.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. Would you have some documentation on this current approach with large model, or even just some projects? Because I'm asking the question because it's something I didn't mention yet, because it's just beginning. Operas has started Operas, the organization I work for, has launched 2 projects, and one especially is based also on the wants to build, let's say, control vocabulary for SSH, but also for interdisciplinarity, and they will build also use also LLM. And yes, if we have some point of comparison from other fields like yours, it would be useful.
Okay, so the LLM is not really my expertise. I'm more of a vocabulary manager, but I could put you in touch with the iAdopt group if you are interested to talk to them.
Okay, okay, fine.
Okay.
I can look. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And just globally speaking, to anyone from here in the audience, just the presentation of the landscape study itself, best practices dimensions, how I called them. Did they seem convincing to you all? Was it something missing? Would you have structured things differently? Please speak up. We're not many, so if you want to speak, just open the mic. Okay. There are no further comments or questions. I suggest we move to the next set of questions, which are about the next steps. Excuse me.
Also, perhaps if you don't want to, open your mic, you could put your comments into the chat. And I think those comments could also, for example, be in French or Spanish. And then we can do, as we are, a multilingual vocabularies group, we can do like a quick
Yes, exactly.
translation of the question. So if anybody doesn't feel comfortable raising a question or comment in English, please feel free to use French or Spanish or German, and the chat will manage to translate them in this one.
Yes, thank you, Liz, for the suggestion. In fact, so the other question about the next steps are actually more generic, a bit less focused on the SSH field or the landscape analysis. First of all, if you know about other recommendations related to vocabularies and that we could reuse, we know now about the iAdopt case, and it's a very good one. If you have other things to other similar documents or information to share with us, please do, even if it's just a link that you can add it. Like Elise was just saying directly in the notes file. I think we could make use of it. And yes, then we had also the question at some point. Maybe you can also give advices on that, or just share thoughts about who should be the target audience for these recommendations. Because for now, the landscape analysis doesn't address this aspect. It's just a global overview, and we didn't address the question of the audience of the final recommendations. They could be like you can see here in the question in the slide. They could be about control vocabulary managers, control vocabulary editors, or users. We thought to focus mostly on managers and editors rather than on users. This comes more or less directly from our own and my own experience of the question. Just to mention that quickly about the history, let's say, of the working group itself. So I'm not an expert myself, like I said, in vocabulary management or building. I'm project officer in various aspects that were more focused on the verification aspects. But still, I'm interested in the topic. But precisely, like I said before in the example of GoTrip, or what we did, is that we created an aggregation platform collecting various resources in the SSH fields, all the SSH fields. And we wanted to have control vocabulary to search into all these results. Just to explain a bit more what it is, this GoTriple platform, it's more or less like OpenAir, if you want, Zenodo, but focused on the SSH RIAs, and but with a dedicated vocabulary, which we call sometimes thesaurus, although it's actually not a complete thesaurus. So what we did in this project is that we used the Library of Congress subject headings, meaning there are topics used in the libraries, the Library of Congress, but also others. And it's used internationally, but it means also that they're not always scientific terms, and they're terms for the libraries. And from that, we extracted a subset specific to the SSH, and we translated it into many languages. I think we have now the vocabulary translated in 14 languages, including languages usually underrepresented, if represented at all, in other multilingual vocabularies, because this was one of the objectives of the GoTriple project, and also partially of this working group, to not limit multilingualism to the main languages, English, Spanish, and so on, but also minor languages, like we had in the group people from Croatia, from Poland, and to have their languages represented also in the thesaurus. But of course, it's a huge work. So what we did precisely was using the machines, and we took the terms from the Library of Congress, and quite a lot of terms actually, specific to the SSH, and we translated them automatically in 13, 14 languages. And then we had a review of the results of the translation, but the review, like I said, was done by people like myself, and I may know some things, I don't know everything, especially when it comes to SSH specific fields and translation specific challenges. And so the result is rather good. The result of the machine translation is rather good. The verification is also rather good, but then here we're talking about control vocabulary for scientific communities, and the result shouldn't be rather good. It should be close to perfect, just from a scientific accuracy point of view. And so that's the reason why there is this question of the target audience. Who should be the target of the recommendation? I think it should be both managers and editors. Managers meaning the people precisely building the project, about the creation and updates of control vocabularies. And then the control vocabulary editors, and here I put myself in this category, just to know exactly what we have to do and what we can do, what we can reasonably do and what we cannot do also. So the recommendations in the working group have this kind of target audience in mind. So, like I said, it's related to the history of the origin of the creation of this working group, but it applies to other use cases, and that's what we saw in the landscape analysis. That precisely this question of the question of the organization of the building of the control vocabulary, not only the principles, but also how you concretely implement them, can be addressed to these recommendations. But I don't know if you have comments about that, but target audience of these recommendations? Either, yeah, if you're a user or not of these control vocabularies. I don't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen, so then there is something or someone raising a hand.
But there was a comment in French from Anne-Sophie, which I deep-L'd into English because unfortunately I don't read French.
Okay.
But
Okay.
do you see it?
Yes. Okay, thank you, Anne-Sophie. We will copy paste that to the minutes. Okay, interesting, yes. I knew, in fact, about AgroPortal example, but for now, like I said, we focused on the SSH case, but I think that now to build the recommendations, we should, in fact, take inspiration also from the other fields. But then we didn't want also to clash with the other RDA working group on the control vocabulary. I don't remember now the name, the BSSG, I don't, EG, anyway. Because precisely they're working more on general guidelines for the control vocabularies, and we wanted to focus on the SSH, but thank you very much, Anne-Sophie, for this suggestion. Okay, so sorry, I don't have much more questions myself to ask to the audience. Sorry if the presentation isn't interactive enough. Maybe the format of the questions or the content of the question could have been a bit different, but I hope at least the presentation was interesting enough. And anyway, you have the access to the slides and then in our contacts also if you want to join this this group specific for to the SSH, but as you see, there are also connections with other fields anyway. So if you want to join the group, just to follow the discussion, it's still possible. And that will be all for me. If there are no questions or other suggestions, I would even stop here. I don't know, Liz, what do you think? Or Gemma, if you want to.
I don't want to call out on anyone, especially because some people might be, engaged with something and just listening in. But I see that we have also somebody, for example, from the Slovenian Social Science Data Archives here.
Okay.
And I wondered if in that context, they have engaged with multilingual controlled vocabularies and if they have any specific comments. I'm just thinking of a data archive with a smaller
Yes.
target language, so to say. But I don't know if Meta is able to speak or rather not. Perhaps not. In that case, I think we have perhaps uncovered some interesting parallels happening in other disciplines where the working group could think about interlinkage and some inspiration. And if there are no more comments, really, either in writing or by unmuting, then we'll end it here.
Yes, no, but thank you for attending the presentation. Again, like I said, you have the link to the slides, the links to the notes also if you want afterwards to add some comments or a suggestion. And you have our contact to all of us, the coordinators of the group. So if you want to reach out, don't hesitate to do it.
And thank you, Alison, for putting the IADOC details into the collaborative notes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.